The heat inside the hangar shimmered like a mirage, turning steel tools into dull mirrors. Outside, the sun burned white through a haze of vapor and dust. Inside, the air smelled of aviation fuel, hot oil, and ambition. The rhythmic thud of riveting guns echoed across the rafters, a metallic heartbeat of an America not yet at war, but already preparing for it. The war in Europe had entered its third autumn. Britain bled. The Luftwaffe ruled the Channel. But in Burbank, men in coveralls worked in 3 shifts beneath humming fluorescent lights, turning aluminum dreams into fighter aircraft machines whose time was coming faster than anyone wanted to admit. Among them was Earl "Red" Jamison, a stocky, red-headed mechanic with a face darkened by years of grease and cigarettes. His colleagues called him the madman in the hangar, half as a joke, half as a warning. Red didn't follow procedure. He didn't believe in limits. He believed in horsepower, altitude, and the stubborn conviction that America's engines could reach higher than any German Messerschmitt. At 38, Jamison was no kid grease monkey. He'd started with Lockheed in the 30s, when the Electra and Hudson were dreams scribbled in Kelly Johnson's notebooks. He knew the Allison V-1710 like it was his own pulse, a 12-cylinder, liquid-cooled engine, elegant and temperamental in equal measure. But he hated its ceiling. 12,000 feet and it gasps like a fish. He'd growl, wiping his hands on an oil rag. "We're building birds that can't breathe above a mountain." In the autumn of 1941, that complaint turned into obsession. Mechanic Jamison altered intercooler lines on V171033 test bench. Unauthorized modification. Claims efficiency increase by 8%. Results pending. Supervisors notified. Maintenance record. B1 Test Bay, Lockheed Aircraft Corp. Jamison worked the night shift by choice. He liked the quiet after the day foreman went home, when only the machines spoke. He'd unbolt the cowling of a P-38 prototype engine, a flashlight in his teeth, humming big band tunes under his breath. Around him, half-assembled lightnings gleamed like silver skeletons in the hangar's darkness. Each one carried 2 of Allison's engines and 2 chances for him to make something the engineers upstairs said was impossible. The problem was altitude. Above 15,000 feet, the Allison engine lost its lungs. Without a 2-stage supercharger, it starved. The British Merlins had solved that with layered compression and intercooling. Lockheed's own engineers had begged Allison to do the same, but the company refused. Too complex, too costly, too risky. Jamison didn't buy that. He scavenged spare turbo housings from scrap bins, tinkering with compressor ratios and bypass valves, using parts meant for scrap metal to chase what he called God's air. He built makeshift intercooler tubes from repurposed coolant lines, wrapping them in asbestos tape, tightening them with borrowed clamps. He wasn't just defying instructions, he was rewriting the rules of altitude itself. "Red's building a time bomb," a colleague muttered one morning, shaking his head as Jamison tuned a V-1710 beyond its rated manifold pressure. But others, the test pilots, especially watched with cautious curiosity. They knew what 8% more power at 25,000 feet could mean. They'd seen what German fighters could do at those heights. Mr. Jamison continues unauthorized testing of dual-stage modification. Efficiency readings inconclusive. Recommend disciplinary action and reassignment. Filed by J.W. Kettering, Chief Engineer. The reprimand came swiftly. Jamison was summoned to the small, wood-paneled office above the main hangar. The supervisor, neat tie, clean fingernails, a company man through and through, didn't even sit down before speaking. "Earl, you're done with these experiments. You understand? You're risking government property." Jamison folded his arms. "Sir, that property doesn't fly worth a damn over 20,000 feet. That's not your concern. It's every pilot's concern." The supervisor sighed. "Your contraptions could destroy an entire squadron if approved." Jamison didn't flinch. Or save one. They suspended him for 3 days unpaid. But in truth, they couldn't afford to lose him. Not in 1941, Not when the orders kept coming in, faster than aluminum could be shipped. He returned quietly to the floor, a man humbled in appearance but unchanged in conviction. His bench was cleaned, his notes gone. Still, he rebuilt them from memory. He could see every bolt, every line, every pressure curve in his mind's eye. He didn't need blueprints. He was the blueprint. By late October, the hangar hummed with urgency. Pearl Harbor was not yet a wound, but the air already smelled of war. Contracts from Washington grew longer, stamped urgent, priority. The Lightning's fast, twin-tailed, alien-looking became Lockheed's obsession. Each one needed engines that could breathe thin air over the Pacific. Jamison's vision, once madness, was starting to look like prophecy. He spent Thanksgiving night alone at the bench, tuning a modified Allison to sustain 3,200 revolutions per minute at 30 inches of boost. The gauges trembled under his hands. The exhaust pipes glowed a dull orange. He listened, eyes closed, to the steady, defiant rhythm, the sound of a machine reaching where none had gone before. In his grease-smudged notebook he wrote, "Altitude is freedom. The man who controls the air above 25,000 feet controls the war below it." Notebook of E. Jamison, November 27, 1941. When the plant whistle blew at midnight, he turned off the ignition, and the sudden silence rang louder than any engine. He knew the men upstairs would never approve it. Not yet. But one day, pilots would fly with his engine under their wings, and one of them, somewhere far across the Pacific, would carry his design straight into history. Historical note, from Lockheed Production Records, 1943. Early intercooler modification prototypes tested at Burbank Plant B1 contributed to later refinements in P-38F and G models' high-altitude performance. Though unofficial, these modifications influenced the twin-turbo systems employed in Operation Vengeance, the 18th of April 1943, allowing intercept range over Bougainville to exceed 600 miles. Declassified. U.S. Air Force Historical Research Agency, 1961. The mad mechanic of Burbank would never see Yamamoto's plane fall from the sky 2 years later. He would never know that his so-called contraption helped make it possible that the impossible engine he built in defiance of orders had given America the reach it needed. But in that hot, humming hangar of 1941, Earl Red Jamison had already fought his own battle. And won. January 14, 1942. Lockheed Engineering Division, Burbank, California. Rain drummed against the corrugated roof, washing the dust of the valley down the gutters. Inside Plant B1, the noise of production had doubled since Pearl Harbor. The war had come, and with it, a fever that gripped every drafting table and every workbench. Overnight, the Lockheed Air Terminal became a fortress of urgency, blackout curtains over windows, MPs at the gates, security badges at every door. Posters hung above the break rooms. Loose lips sink ships. The men barely looked up. They were already at war. In a corner of the main hangar, Earl Red Jamison returned to his bench with a government stamp of approval and a quiet grudge. His suspension had been quietly lifted in December when production managers realized that the P-38's altitude problem wasn't going away. The Air Corps wanted results, not excuses, and Jamison's unorthodox engine experiments, the same ones that had nearly gotten him fired, were now the talk of the engineering wing. What had been insubordination in September was suddenly innovation in January. But there was a new obstacle now, one even more immovable than management. The Bureau of Aeronautics. The Bureau had jurisdiction over all U.S. Army and Navy aircraft designs, and its engineers, far removed from the hangar floor, distrusted improvisation. To them, rules and tolerances were sacrosanct. An engine that performed outside its rated limits was not a success, it was a liability. Internal memo. Bureau of Aeronautics, January 8, 1942. All experimental modifications to Allison power plants not sanctioned by official engineering bulletins are to cease immediately. Unauthorized alterations to turbocharger systems represent a direct violation of Air Corps Specification AC 3129. Deviations will be reported. Lieutenant Kemdar. R. E. Fullerton. Buair Propulsion Liaison Jamison read that memo twice and laughed bitterly. Funny, he told his foreman, the Japs don't seem to care about bulletins. The war had already changed the tone of the shop floor. What once had been a hum of steady production now carried a nervous undercurrent. The newspapers spoke of defeats in the Philippines, of Bataan and Wake Island, of aircraft lost to Zeros that climbed faster and fought higher than anything America could yet build. Every report made Jamison's hands tighten around his wrench. He spent nights refining his mad design, a hybrid intercooler and dual-stage supercharger system patched together from spare P-38E components. The official Allison plant in Indianapolis had rejected the concept months before, calling it mechanically unstable. But Jamison had seen the data himself. When cooled and properly regulated, the V-1710's boost pressure could be safely increased by 20%. That meant another 1,000 feet of climb for every minute of ascent. That meant survival, and so he worked methodical, silent, defiant. By February, his design had reached the desk of Clarence Kelly Johnson, Lockheed's chief engineer. Johnson was a legend in the making, the man whose drafting pen had shaped the Lightning's iconic twin tail. He was also pragmatic. He understood that genius sometimes came wrapped in grease and stubbornness. He called Jamison into his office on February 3rd. The rain had stopped, and the distant mountains were capped with white. Johnson's desk was covered in blueprints, ashtrays, and coffee cups. "You built this thing by yourself?" Johnson asked, holding up a set of greasy pencil-scribbled sketches labeled V1710 Mod Dual Flow. Jamison nodded. "Started it back in September." Johnson scanned the drawings. "Your intercooler routing looks like something out of a plumbing catalogue." "It works." "You tested it?" "Bench run. 3,200 RPM at 30 inches. No detonation." Johnson raised an eyebrow. "And how long did it hold?" 2 hours 20 minutes before coolant overflow." Johnson leaned back, silent. For a moment, the only sound was the rain dripping from his coat on the chair. Finally, he smiled, a rare expression from a man known for discipline. "Red, you're out of your mind," he said. "But maybe that's exactly what we need." Engineering log, February 7th, 1942. Prototype installation of modified intercooler approved for static test on airframe 38 to 236. Jamison to supervise under direct oversight of Johnson. Designation: Experimental High Altitude V-1710. Lockheed Internal Test Record. The test took place on a quiet Sunday morning. The plant was nearly empty, except for the crew that volunteered: mechanics, engineers, and 2 pilots who wanted to see what the mad mechanic had built. The modified engine was mounted on a steel frame outside the hangar, its twin turbochargers gleaming like brass lungs. The hoses looked improvised, but every joint was sealed, every line measured, to Jamison's hand-drawn tolerances. When he threw the switch, the V-1710 roared to life. The first burst of smoke filled the air, then cleared. The gauges climbed steadily. 20 inches of manifold pressure, 25, 28. Jamison's jaw tightened. "Throttle it up," Johnson said. The engine screamed, the sound sharp and clean. The tachometer needle climbed to 3,300 revolutions per minute. The intercooler temperature held steady at 190 degrees. The fuel mixture ran rich but stable. For 5 minutes, the entire system held at pressures the Bureau had said were impossible. Then the right turbo coughed, backfired, and a burst of flame shot from the exhaust. The crew dove for cover, but Jamison stood his ground, one hand on the cutoff. The flame died as quickly as it appeared. The gauges returned to normal. "She's breathing," Jamison muttered. "For the first time, she's breathing up there." The data confirmed it. a 17% improvement in sustained horsepower above 20,000 feet, enough to close the gap between the P-38 and the enemy's Zeros and Tonys. But when the report reached Washington, it wasn't celebration that followed, it was silence. Weeks passed. The Bureau refused to authorize further testing. Official correspondence cited unverified modifications and safety concerns. Jamison's engine was effectively blacklisted. By March, word reached the floor that the Army had accepted the standard Allison design for mass production unmodified, unenhanced, and, in Jamison's words, half-blind above 20,000 feet. The mechanic's fury boiled quietly. To the men around him, he became a ghost, still working, still smoking, but saying little. His notes grew longer and angrier, margins filled with equations, altitude charts, and bitterness. "The bureaucrats will kill more pilots than the enemy," he wrote one night in his logbook. Jamison, the 12th of March 1942. But fate, like machinery, sometimes finds its own pressure, a line. In April, a letter arrived at Lockheed bearing a new insignia headquarters, 13 Fighter Command. They wanted long-range Lightnings for an extended Pacific operation. The specifications demanded something radical. 600 miles of combat radius at altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet. No existing Allison could meet that demand. Johnson walked the length of the hangar, found Jamison at his bench, and dropped the letter on the table. "You still have that crazy setup of yours?" he asked. Jamison looked up, his eyes tired but alive again. "You mean the one the Bureau buried?" Johnson nodded. "That one." Jamison grinned faintly. "Yeah, I've still got it." Excerpt. U.S. Army Air Force's Procurement Report, April 1942. Special Field Modification Program authorized for select P-38 units. Priority, range and altitude extension. Technical consultation permitted with Lockheed engineering personnel under Kelly Johnson. USAAF HQ, Materiel Command. That night, Jamison returned to the hangar alone. The plant was dark, silent except for distant rain on the roof. He placed his palm on the cool metal cowling of a half-built Lightning and whispered, almost to himself, "They'll need you soon. Every inch of air you can give them." He didn't know that his engine refined, tested, and quietly installed on a select few P-38 seconds would soon power the mission that would change the war in the Pacific. But for now, in the echoing hangar at Burbank, the mad mechanic simply lit another cigarette, opened his notebook, and began to draw. "Altitude is victory. Someday they'll see it." Notebook of E. Jamison, April 1942. The jungle never truly slept. Even at night, it buzzed, breathed, and whispered. Beneath the feverish hum of insects, the distant ocean sighed against black volcanic sand. The air smelled of salt, sweat, and oil, the scent of war without glory. In the dim light of the maintenance bay, a group of mechanics worked beneath the wings of 24 P-38 Lightnings, their hands slick with grease and tropical humidity. They weren't just prepping aircraft, they were nursing living machines. Among them was a crate that had been shipped from Burbank, California, its label faded but legible. Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. Priority freight, experimental components. Inside that crate was the culmination of one man's defiance. Earl read, Jamison's modified intercooler assemblies, shipped unofficially under replacement parts by sympathetic engineers at Lockheed. The men of the 339th Fighter Squadron, 13 Fighter Command, didn't care what Washington thought of the modifications. They cared that the new engines ran cooler, climbed faster, and didn't choke at 25,000 feet. For the first time, they could meet the enemy on equal terms or better. Maintenance log, April 17, 1943. Intercooler system adjusted per Lockheed field instructions. Performance increase noted in climb rate. Unauthorized mods per BUAR regs, but command-approved field use for mission readiness. Crew Chief, 339th FS, Guadalcanal Captain Thomas G. Lanphier, Jr., leaned against the wing of his P-38F, the morning sun glinting off the twin booms. He was a confident man, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, the kind of pilot who believed luck was for amateurs. Beside him stood Major John W. Mitchell, the squadron commander, silent and calculating. Tomorrow's mission was unlike anything they'd ever attempted. At 0600 hours, 13 Lightnings would take off from Guadalcanal, heading northwest toward Bougainville, nearly 600 miles away, deep behind enemy lines. Their target was not a ship nor a base, but a man. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy and architect of Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's inspection flight had been intercepted through a code break. The Americans knew his schedule to the minute: departure from Rabaul at 6, arrival at Balale at 9:45. The plan was audacious: to intercept him mid-air, shoot him down, and be home before the Japanese even knew what had happened. The problem? No American fighter could reach Bougainville and return. No standard fighter except the P-38 Lightning. And not just any Lightning. It had to be one modified for range, altitude, and endurance. That meant Jamison's engines. Excerpt: 13 Fighter Command Operations Order 70. All aircraft to utilize extended-range tanks and modified power plants as available. Priority given to high-altitude climb and sustained cruise capacity. Mission range: 1,000 miles round trip. Intercept time: 9:35 local. In the dark of early morning, the mechanics worked without pause. Sweat rolled down their backs as they checked coolant pressures and fuel lines. One of them, Sergeant Clay Wilson, muttered, "Whoever built these damn engines deserves a medal." Another replied, "You can thank some crazy redhead back in Burbank for that." By dawn, the planes stood ready. The modified Allisons, the same dual-stage intercooler-fed power plants that Jamison had built and the Bureau had condemned, now hummed under Pacific skies, waiting for war. At 0700, Major Mitchell gave the signal. The first Lightning rolled down the runway, propellers slicing through the humid air, engines roaring in perfect unison. Each aircraft carried 310 gallons of fuel, just enough for the mission, and not a drop more. Climb rate above expectation, engine temperature stable at 24,000 feet, fuel mixture even, formation proceeding on schedule. For nearly 2 hours, they flew low over the ocean to avoid radar, their shadows skimming the waves. The pilots said little, conserving oxygen and focus. The tropical air turned thin, then colder, as they approached Bougainville. At 9:34, just as predicted, a Japanese formation appeared: 2 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, escorted by 6 Zeros. Lanfear's voice cut through radio static. "That's him," Mitchell responded calmly. "Let's make it count." The Lightnings climbed, throttles wide open. Jamison's engines responded like living things, their turbochargers singing at high altitude, intercoolers keeping the fuel mixture steady. No sputter, no choke, no stall. Every gauge held true. Lanfear rolled into a climb, diving through the Japanese escort. His .50 calibers spat white fire. Below, Major Rex Barber closed in on the lead bomber, the one carrying Yamamoto himself. At 9:43, Barber's tracers ripped through the Betty's right engine. The aircraft burst into flame, its wing shearing off as it spiraled toward the jungle canopy. Moments later, it struck the earth in a column of black smoke. The mission was over in minutes. The Lightnings turned for home, low on fuel but triumphant. They'd flown farther, faster, and higher than any American fighter squadron before them and returned alive. When they landed back at Guadalcanal, the men of the 339th were silent at first. No cheers, no shouts. Just the sound of engines winding down, ticking softly as the metal cooled. Then someone whispered, "We got him." Word spread like wildfire through the Pacific theater. Yamamoto was dead. The architect of Pearl Harbor had fallen, shot down by the very machines his attack had once sought to destroy. Thousands of miles away, in a quiet corner of the Lockheed plant in Burbank, Earl Red Jamison was bent over a new prototype. Grease on his hands, a cigarette in his mouth. He didn't know yet. Not until 2 days later, when the Los Angeles Times ran the headline, "Admiral Yamamoto killed in air. Ambush." He read every word, eyes narrowing as the story described the daring long-range mission made possible by the twin-engine P-38 Lightning. Jamison set down the paper, exhaled a slow, disbelieving breath, and said quietly to himself, "She made it." He never spoke publicly about his role. His name appeared on no citation, no report. But the pilots who'd flown that day, the ones who'd climbed into skies few thought reachable, knew that their victory had begun in a hangar half a world away, under the hands of a mechanic the company once called MAD. Post-War Technical Review, Air Force Historical Research Agency, 1947. Field modifications originating at Lockheed Burbank contributed significantly to the improved high-altitude performance of P-38 aircraft employed in Operation Vengeance. These innovations, though unofficial, directly affected mission success. The file was stamped declassified in 1961. By then, Jamison was gone a heart attack in his sleep, age 59. His notebooks, however, survived, filled with calculations, diagrams, and a single sentence scrawled across the last page in his rough, oil-stained handwriting. "Engines are just men. After all, they only fail when they stop trying to breathe." And so the mad Mechanic of Burbank lived on, not in textbooks or memorials, but in every whisper of power that lifted a pilot toward the thin, dangerous air of victory. May 9th, 1946, Dayton, Ohio, Air Technical Service Command Headquarters. The war was over, but the papers didn't stop coming. The office smelled of carbon copies, stale coffee, and the quiet shuffle of forgotten heroes. Engineers in grey suits combed through stacks of field reports, deciding which innovations would survive the peacetime purge and which would vanish into classified archives. At the end of a long table sat Colonel Frank Dyer, reviewing a faded folder marked Unverified Field Modifications P-38 Platform. He adjusted his spectacles and frowned at the name scribbled across the margin. Jamison E.W., Civilian Contractor, Lockheed. The accompanying memo was short. Unauthorized engine alterations. Performance results anecdotal. No formal testing. Recommend closure. Dyer tapped his pen against the page. "Unauthorized," he muttered. "Hell of a word for something that killed Yamamoto." But the bureaucracy was a machine of its own, one that didn't run on courage or ingenuity, but compliance. Within days, Jamison's work was boxed, stamped, and shelved in a warehouse that smelled of dust and victory long forgotten. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, Lockheed had moved on. New aircraft, new wars to imagine. The Lightning had served its purpose and faded into history, replaced by jets that owed more to German blueprints than to American mechanics. Yet something lingered. In 1952, at Edwards Air Force Base, a young test engineer named Harold Hal Renner stumbled across Jamison's old intercooler schematics while studying airflow dynamics. The notes were crude but brilliant lines drawn in pencil, annotated with instinct rather than mathematics. Renner tested the concept on a prototype jet compressor. The result was unexpected. Lower operating temperatures, smoother airflow, and faster climb rates. "Who the hell was this guy?" he asked. An older engineer replied. "They called him Red, worked on the Lightnings, got in trouble for thinking too loud." Renner grinned. "Sounds like my kind of trouble." By 1954, aspects of Jamison's designs quietly resurfaced in early jet turbine cooling systems. No one mentioned his name, but the fingerprints were there in every smooth curve of metal that refused to overheat, in every plane that climbed just a little higher than it should have. Still, the man himself remained a ghost. His widow, Clara Jamison, lived in a small house in Glendale, surrounded by fading photographs and the quiet hum of distant engines. Every Sunday, she polished the wrench that had hung over his workbench. She never knew the full extent of what he'd done, the missions, the engines, the lives saved by his defiance. In 1961, a letter arrived from an Air Force historian seeking background on unauthorized Lockheed innovations during wartime production. It was the first time anyone had written her about Earl since his death. She replied in neat handwriting, "He didn't build machines, he built chances. That's what he called them. Chances for boys to come home." The historian filed her letter with the rest under Miscellaneous Civilian Contributions, World War II. Years later, when the Air Force Museum displayed a restored P-38 Lightning under glass, a small brass plaque at its base read, "Aircraft type, Lockheed P-38J Lightning, range, 1,300 miles. Engine, Allison V-1710, twin turbocharged. Nothing more, but if you stood close enough, you could still see the faint, almost invisible etching inside one of the intercooler housings, a mark made by hand long before the mission, before the glory, before the silence. A mechanic's initials, a whisper in metal. A reminder that sometimes the ones who build history are the same ones history forgets to name. The desert sun beat down on a row of gleaming, experimental aircraft, each one humming with promise and danger. Test pilots walked briskly along the tarmac, their helmets tucked under arms, clipboards in hand, minds focused on speed, altitude, and performance. Among them, Major Harold Renner carried a different sort of excitement, one not measured in knots or feet per second. Renner had spent the last 6 months poring over dusty Lockheed schematics he'd stumbled upon in the old archives. They were labeled simply, Jamison, intercooler engine modifications, 1941–1943. At first glance, they looked like the usual doodles of a genius at war, complex airflow paths, hand-scribbled notes, strange symbols denoting heat tolerances and RPM limits. But when Renner traced the diagrams, something extraordinary emerged. Jamison had anticipated many challenges of high-performance, high-altitude engines decades before engineers even imagined them. Who was this guy? Renner muttered aloud, staring at the intercooler modification. He built an engine to climb higher, stay cooler, and take punishment the way only a P-38 could. In the control room, a younger engineer named Lieutenant Philip O'Malley looked over his shoulder. "Some Lockheed mechanic from the war? You're telling me this is relevant to our F-105 turbofans?" Renner nodded. Not just relevant, revolutionary. He figured out ways to keep air moving at altitude, reduce detonation, and maintain reliability under conditions that would kill most engines. And he did it with pencil, paper, and a wrench. By June 1963, Renner and his team had constructed a test stand replicating Jamison's dual-stage intercooler modifications. The first engine fired up with a hiss and a roar, the aluminum and steel trembling under forces designed for men long gone. Monitors traced temperature curves, boost pressures, and RPMs with surgical precision. When the data came back, the engineers leaned forward in disbelief. Peak performance exceeded predictions. Cooling efficiency had improved by 15%. Surge and detonation risks, long considered unavoidable at extreme altitude, had dropped to near zero. This was wartime ingenuity translated into modern jet engineering. At the next conference, Renner presented the findings to Air Force leadership. Generals in starched uniforms frowned at diagrams of interwoven tubes, thermocouples, and annotations in cramped handwriting. "You're telling me a mechanic in Burbank, back in 1941, solved problems our best engineers are still struggling with?" one asked, incredulous. Renner's response was simple. Yes, and he did it at a time when the P-38's missions depended on it. "We owe a lot more than our thanks to Earl Red Jamison." The Air Force quietly authorized the adaptation of Jamison's designs into experimental long-range reconnaissance engines. No one made a public announcement. There were no medals, no headlines. History still had a habit of overlooking mechanics. But in the high desert at Edwards, engineers and pilots felt the ghost of a man whose obsession with power, altitude, and survivability had saved lives decades earlier. Meanwhile, back in Glendale, Clara Jamison received a letter from Renner. It was brief, but it carried the weight of decades of recognition. "Your husband's work is saving lives again, this time in jets we never imagined. His genius was not forgotten. We only wish he had lived to see it. She held the letter close, remembering the nights when Earl would disappear into the hangar, the smell of oil thick in the air, the sound of metal vibrating under his hands. She could almost hear him muttering, "It'll climb higher, it'll go further, it'll make them pay attention." The old P-38 seconds had long since returned to museums, wings polished, canopies gleaming. But in secret test cells and classified engineering reports, Jamison's fingerprints endured. Every supercharged engine, every high-altitude reconnaissance flight, carried the echo of a mechanic who had defied orders, defied convention, and in doing so, had changed the course of aerial warfare. By the time Renner walked across the tarmac that afternoon, the desert sun casting long shadows over experimental jets, he paused. He whispered, almost to himself, "Thank you, Red. We're still learning from you." And somewhere in the hum of turbines, in the whisper of air through intercoolers, the man in Burbank smiled. The distant roar of jet engines filled the valley, a constant reminder that the age of piston-driven fighters had given way to sleek, supersonic aircraft. But in a quiet corner of the Skunk Works archives, the story of Earl Red Jamison refused to fade. Files, sketches, and yellowed notes lay stacked in meticulous order, collected by engineers who understood that the past often held the key to the future. Among them was Dr. Margaret Hayes, a senior aeronautical engineer specializing in high-altitude propulsion systems. She had grown up reading about the P-38 Lightning, fascinated not by the pilots or the dogfights, but by the engines that had powered those missions. Jamison's name had surfaced repeatedly in her research, always accompanied by whispers of incredulity. The mad mechanic who defied blueprints, ignored orders, and somehow engineered what many considered impossible. That morning, Margaret traced her fingers along one of Jamison's original diagrams, the ink smudged from decades of handling. The dual-stage intercooler design was elegant in its simplicity, yet daring in execution. He didn't just build engines, she whispered to herself. He anticipated everything: airflow, cooling, detonation, years before anyone else thought it possible. Her colleague, Tom Keller, peered over her shoulder, squinting at the tiny notations. "I still don't get it," he admitted. "How did a single mechanic pull this off in the middle of wartime chaos?" Genius, and a willingness to be called insane. That's how. By noon, the small research team had set up a demonstration using a prototype engine modeled directly from Jamison's schematics. The engine roared to life, vibrations resonating through the hangar floor. Telemetry monitors displayed data that, even by 1975 standards, was exceptional. The intercoolers maintained near-ideal temperatures at simulated altitudes above 40,000 feet. Boost pressures climbed without detonation. The system, decades ahead of its time, validated every scribble in Jamison's notes. Later that afternoon, Margaret gave a lecture to a group of Lockheed engineers and historians. Slides of Jamison's handwritten notes flashed on the screen, diagrams of airflow paths, annotations on pressure ratios, and temperature limits. "This is more than a historical curiosity," she emphasized. "Jamison's work provides a framework we still use when designing high-performance engines. Every turbojet, every high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft owes a debt to his ingenuity." Questions followed. How had Lockheed management reacted during the war? Why had he never received formal recognition? Margaret explained, "His engines were deemed too experimental, too dangerous. Management feared approving them might destroy an entire squadron. And yet, when the P-38 seconds intercepted Admiral Yamamoto, they flew with engines influenced by Jamison's modifications, engines capable of extreme altitude and range." A hush fell over the room as the weight of her words settled. The audience pictured Burbank in 1941. A young mechanic hunched over a roaring engine, grease-stained hands tracing impossible designs, managers shaking their heads in disbelief. They saw a man unafraid of authority, driven by an obsession to push limits beyond what anyone imagined. Margaret continued, pulling slides of post-war debriefings. Pilots recounted how some P-38 seconds seemed supernaturally capable at high altitude, performing maneuvers that exceeded the expected limits of the Allison V-1710 engine. Interrogation reports of Japanese officers confirmed that Lightning squadrons could strike from altitudes and ranges previously thought impossible, giving Allied forces a decisive edge. Every success, she noted, traced back to the genius of one man working in obscurity. That evening, Margaret walked through the quiet hangar, engines humming softly, the scent of oil and ozone faintly lingering a ghostly echo of Jamison's world. She paused before a display of restored P-38 seconds. Their polished noses and gleaming propellers gleamed in the setting sun. "You were right, Red," she whispered. "They finally understand." Across the country, in Glendale, Clara Jamison, now in her 70s, received a letter from the Air Force Historical Office. It contained photographs of Jamison's notes displayed in the Skunk Works archives, accompanied by a formal acknowledgement. Earl Red Jamison's experimental engine modifications contributed significantly to the success of high-altitude operations during World War II. His ingenuity, though unrecognized at the time, is now officially acknowledged as a vital component of aviation history. Clara held the letter close to her chest. Memories flooded back nights when Earl had disappeared into the hangar, the smell of warm metal and fuel, the nervous laughter when management scolded him for endangering the squadron. She remembered his proud grin when tests succeeded, his muttered threats that they'll all see one day. That day had come. In the years that followed, Jamison's work influenced modern aviation design. Engineers studying his intercooler methods adapted the principles to jet engines, increasing efficiency and longevity. Pilots credited the reliability of high-performance aircraft to concepts first imagined on a Burbank hangar floor. Historians cited him in academic papers on World War II aviation. Jamison's name, once whispered in disbelief, became synonymous with audacious engineering brilliance. At a small ceremony in 1980, the Lockheed Historical Society unveiled a plaque commemorating Earl Red Jamison. Inscribed in brass letters were the words, "To a man who refused to accept limits, whose obsession with possibility saved lives, and whose genius continues to inspire. The Mad Mechanic of Burbank, 1941–1943. Margaret Hayes, now serving as a guest speaker, addressed the crowd. "We honor a mechanic, yes. But we honor more than that. We honor curiosity, courage, and the relentless pursuit of what others deem impossible." Earl Jamison reminds us that genius is not always found in titles or ranks. Sometimes it's found in grease-stained overalls and a refusal to take no for an answer. As the crowd dispersed, Margaret lingered, gazing at the P-38 seconds and the small archives surrounding them. She imagined Earl hunched over a table, scribbling notes, fingers black with oil, muttering to himself about airflow, boost pressure, and intercooler efficiency. She smiled. The man who had once been called mad had achieved a kind of immortality far beyond medals or recognition. His engines, his ideas, and his stubborn brilliance continued to propel the future. And somewhere, in the hum of experimental turbines and the whisper of wind across airstrips, the legacy of Earl Red Jamison lived on, a testament to the power of obsession, ingenuity, and daring to defy convention. Earl Red Jamison had long since retired from the roar of assembly lines, the clang of tools, and the endless hum of wartime factories. But at 71, he carried with him a lifetime of memory, each detail of the Lockheed hangars, the P-38 Lightning test flights, and the countless hours hunched over engines still vivid as if yesterday. The world had finally begun to recognize the quiet genius of the man once deemed mad. Yet for Jamison, validation had never been his pursuit. He had chased only one thing: the impossible. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of his modest Glendale home, illuminating sketches of engine modifications pinned to the walls, some faded nearly to invisibility. His granddaughter Lily perched on the edge of a chair, flipping through a photo album containing black and white images of wartime aircraft. "Grandpa," she asked, pointing to a photograph of a P-38 Lightning, twin booms gleaming in the sunlight. "Did you really make this engine work?" Jamison chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. "Made it work?" "Lily, I made it defy every rule they tried to cage it with. They called me mad for it. I called it careful curiosity." He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. This engine carried men to heights and distances nobody believed possible, and one day it even changed the course of a war. It was the same war that had defined much of his life. Operation Vengeance. The mission to intercept Admiral Yamamoto, the Japanese strategist whose death would become a pivotal turning point in the Pacific theater. Jamison remembered the day he learned his experimental modifications had been installed on the long-range P-38 seconds. He had received no accolades, no medals, only the quiet satisfaction that his relentless tinkering had contributed to history. Yet history had a way of circling back. Over the decades, Jamison's name had resurfaced in scholarly papers, veterans' reunions, and the halls of aviation museums. The Smithsonian had acquired his notes, Lockheed engineers had preserved his prototypes, and even Japanese post-war interrogations confirmed the extraordinary capabilities of the aircraft he helped perfect. It was a strange, delayed recognition one earned not by speeches or parades, but by the undeniable precision of metal, airflow, and fire. That afternoon, Jamison decided to visit a local aviation museum. He moved slowly but deliberately, leaning on a cane, as he navigated the polished floors and the echoing halls filled with artifacts of a war that had once consumed his life. His eyes lit up when he reached a P-38 Lightning suspended mid-air, its twin engines a tribute to decades of mechanical evolution. Beside it, a placard detailed the role of Lockheed mechanics in advancing high-altitude performance. Among the names, written almost as a footnote, was Earl "Red" Jamison. Jamison ran his fingers lightly along the cold metal of the plane. Memories flooded him. Nights spent experimenting with dual-stage intercoolers, the frustration of broken components, the elation of successful test runs, and the stinging reprimands from management who feared his engines could destroy an entire squadron. Yet every setback, every criticism, had only sharpened his resolve. The engine had to work for the pilots, for the war, and ultimately, for the future. A museum guide approached, recognizing the older man from previous visits. "Sir, I hope you don't mind, but I've heard stories," he said, gesturing to the exhibit, "that you were the man who designed the engine modifications for these long-range P-38 seconds." Jamison smiled faintly. "Stories often embellish. But yes, I worked on those engines. I took what everyone said was impossible and made it work." He paused, eyes drifting upward to the aircraft. "I didn't do it for glory. I did it because someone had to see what could be done if no one else dared." Later that evening, Jamison returned home, settling into a chair beside a small wooden table cluttered with sketches, notes, and models. Lily returned from school, her backpack hanging by the door. She had drawn a picture of a P-38, wings outstretched, engines roaring, and proudly placed it beside her grandfather. "Grandpa, I want to build planes like you one day," she said earnestly. Jamison studied her determined expression, and for the first time in decades, allowed himself a rare, quiet pride. "Then you will, Lily. You will. And maybe one day you'll go further than I ever dreamed." The days that followed were spent in reflection. Jamison revisited old journals, piecing together a timeline of his experiments, noting which innovations had succeeded, which had failed, and which had transformed aviation. He wrote letters to engineers, historians, and even former pilots, recounting the minute details of his work. The precise boost pressures, the tweaks to fuel mixture, the challenges of maintaining intercooler efficiency at extreme altitudes. Each page a testament to a life devoted not to recognition, but to mastery. On a crisp morning in late April, Jamison received a letter from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. They were organizing a symposium on aviation innovation and requested his presence to speak on the role of mechanics in wartime aircraft performance. For decades, he had remained in the shadows, content with his work's impact remaining quiet. Yet the invitation struck a chord. He accepted, not for fame, but to ensure that future generations understood the vital role of ingenuity, persistence, and daring in the face of doubt. The symposium was held in a grand hall filled with engineers, historians, veterans, and students. Jamison, frail but steady, recounted the story of the P-38 engines, the dual-stage intercoolers, and the relentless nights in the Burbank hangar. He spoke not just of mechanical specifications, boost pressures, RPMs, altitude performance, but of philosophy. The need to challenge assumptions, to question authority, and to pursue excellence with unwavering focus. Audience members listened in rapt silence, captivated by the story of a man whose genius had been quiet, unassuming, yet utterly transformative. As he left the stage, several veterans approached him, shaking his hand, sharing personal accounts of missions flown in aircraft powered by his innovations. One pilot, now in his 70s, leaned close and said softly, "Red, without your engines, we wouldn't have reached him. Yamamoto never would have fallen. You changed the course of history." Jamison's eyes glistened. He had never sought such acknowledgement, yet in that moment, the weight of decades of silence lifted. Back home, Jamison returned to his sketches one final time. He traced the lines of a dual-stage intercooler, the airflow pathways, the meticulous balance of fuel and compression. He knew that, in these diagrams, his essence endured a record of a life devoted to surpassing limits, of a mind that refused to settle for the ordinary. That night, as he lay in bed, Jamison closed his eyes, visions of Burbank hangars and P-38 cockpits filling his mind. The war, the engines, the missions all converged in a tapestry of memory and accomplishment. He breathed deeply, comforted by the knowledge that his work had not only survived, but had inspired generations of engineers and pilots. Earl read Jamison past, and quietly in his sleep the next morning, leaving behind a legacy etched in steel, fuel, and human ingenuity. The world would remember him not merely as a mechanic, not merely as a madman, but as a pioneer whose vision transcended the boundaries of convention and whose engines had, in their own way, shaped history. In classrooms, hangars, and museums, his story lived on, a reminder that courage, curiosity, and the refusal to accept limits could change the world. From the hum of modern engines to the tales of daring pilots, the spirit of the mad mechanic who built the impossible endured an eternal tribute to the relentless pursuit of innovation. April 18, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The tropical sun hung low over the tarmac, baking the metal skin of the P-38 Lightnings lined up in neat, glinting rows. The hum of generators, the rhythmic pounding of rivets, and the hiss of hydraulic systems formed a relentless industrial symphony, punctuated by the occasional roar of an engine test run. The air was thick with heat, fuel vapor, and the salty tang of the nearby Pacific. Mechanics in sweat-stained overalls moved with precise choreography, their hands slick with oil as they performed pre-flight inspections. Among them, Earl Red Jamison stood, arms folded, eyes scanning the gleaming engines, his mind elsewhere. Jamison's P-38 seconds were unlike any others on the island. The dual-stage, intercooler-modified Allison V-1710 seconds roared with a deeper, more aggressive note. The boost gauges read higher than standard, RPMs flirted with forbidden limits, and the intercoolers shivered under the strain of compressed intake air. His modifications had already begun turning heads. Pilots reported unprecedented climb rates, instantaneous acceleration, and remarkable stability under stress. Where the stock Lightning might struggle above 20,000 feet, Jamison's engines pushed cleanly past 28,000, granting American pilots a previously unattainable tactical advantage over Japanese Zeros and Tony fighters. The day began with the usual tension. Radar nets had picked up Japanese reconnaissance aircraft probing the area. Intelligence suggested a possible strike against Henderson Field, though the exact target and strength remained unknown. Major Thomas H. Larkin, commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Squadron, walked the line of lightnings, clipboard in hand, sweat beading on his brow. He was a man who valued precision and discipline, but even he could not conceal the awe in his eyes as he studied the modified engines. "Jamison," he said, voice low but edged with urgency, "you've pushed these engines harder than anyone thought possible. Are you sure they'll hold?" Jamison smirked, wiping a sheen of sweat from his forehead. "They'll hold. And then some. We've got 50,000 feet of air above these islands, Major. They won't know what hit them." His confidence was infuriating to some, inspiring to others. Engineers still loyal to Lockheed's original blueprints muttered that Jamison's creations were mad science, but pilots and ground crews alike had learned to respect the results. Each engine carried detailed logbooks Jamison kept himself, with meticulous notes, boost pressures, intercooler temperatures, manifold readings, and RPM thresholds. The handwriting was cramped, the calculations dense, but the performance numbers were undeniable. By 0930 hours, the squadron was airborne. The Lightnings lifted off in tight formation, their engines vibrating with controlled fury. Jamison, though officially a ground mechanic, insisted on observing every sortie from the control tower's viewing deck. He scribbled notes as the aircraft climbed in echelon, plotting climb rates, airspeed, and predicted engagement altitudes. It was one thing to theorize in the hangar. It was entirely another to watch the results manifest in real time over a hostile sky. At 25,000 feet, Japanese aircraft appeared. 6 Zeros, flying low and fast, attempting to avoid radar detection. The pilots of the 339th Lightnings, many of them still green in combat experience, were instructed to maintain altitude and hold fire until ordered. Jamison's engines delivered instantaneous throttle response, allowing the Lightnings to position themselves above the Japanese fighters in a classic boom and zoom tactic perfected through weeks of trials. The altitude advantage, impossible for standard P-38 seconds to exploit fully, now became decisive. The first attack came from the east. Lieutenant James H. Jimmy O'Neill, flying Red 2, reported contact. Visual on hostiles, 12 o'clock, diving. His radio crackled, voice tense. The Lightnings rolled, their modified engines screaming. In seconds, the squadron converted potential energy into kinetic fury. Dive speed exceeded anything the Japanese pilots expected. At 420 miles per hour, O'Neill's Lightning closed the distance in a heartbeat. 8. 50 caliber Browning machine guns converged in a deadly matrix, and the first Zero disintegrated under the concentrated hail of fire, wings separating, fuselage fragmenting mid-air. The rest of the Zeros scattered, attempting to evade an enemy they had no reason to respect at that altitude. From the control tower, Jamison's eyes widened. "That's it," he muttered, under his breath. Exactly as predicted. He marked each kill on his pad, annotating the climb angles, convergence distances, and RPMs at impact. These were not lucky shots. They were the realization of months of obsessive work, years of testing, and the audacity to defy orders that had once prohibited dual-stage engines and intercoolers. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes, but the implications were enormous. 4 Zeros destroyed, 2 damaged, no American losses. Squadron morale soared, but the Japanese pilots' reports, transmitted to the 4th Air Group's headquarters, revealed mounting disbelief and fear. One post-war interrogation would later record, "The American planes climbed too fast, dove too hard, fired without hesitation. We could not escape." Back on the ground, Jamison walked among the returning Lightnings. Pilots were laughing, exhilarated. Their aircraft had performed beyond expectations, engines operating at extremes without a single catastrophic failure. "Red, you mad genius," Major Larkin said, clapping him on the shoulder. "I don't know whether to salute or ground you for life." Jamison merely smiled, wiping grime from his hands. "I told you, Major, it's not about genius, it's about physics. and a little bit of American stubbornness,